Or, I got interrupted, but yeah, so basically, um, starting where I left off, basically how Shai prayed for you elect, you know, so yeah, and ultimately, you know, there's a path, there's a path ultimately laid for you election, man, you know, and it cannot be hindered, it cannot be frustrated, you know, but it will be done. It's St. John chapter 10, verse 28. It says, "And I give unto them eternal life." Yeah, you elect. You have life through the death and resurrection of Yahweh Shai, through the Spirit, through the Word, man. You have life, and you have immortality, in the form of those immortal bodies, you know, uh, in the future. It's going to be given you in the future. It says, "And I give unto them eternal life, and they shall never perish." So you elect will never fail. You elect will not be condemned. Fall out of the truth. Walk out of the way of everlasting life. Out of the way of God's goodness, because that's ultimately uh, when you do that, or when you are outside of the truth, when you are outside of the faith, when you are outside of God's goodness, you're ultimately dead already. Ultimately, so you elect. Ultimately, you have an overwhelming victory. It says, "Neither shall any man pluck them out of my hands." So your elect will not be taken away from truth. You will not be taken away from life. You will not be taken away from God's love, from God's goodness, man, from God's power. Which everything is subject to God's power, but when it comes to you elect, God's power towards you is for your good, which is not the case for everyone. So you elect, just like everyone, is subject and ruled over by this divine force, but this force is working for your good, is bringing out your good, is leading you to good. In fact, when you go into that word hand, you know let's go into that word hand. Is figurative for power, in determining and controlling the destinies of men. So you elect cannot be taken out of the way, the truth, and the life. You cannot walk outside of the way. Nothing can take you outside of the way of God's goodness, of wisdom, the whole package. Nothing can come in between that. It says, "My Father, which gave them me, is greater than all, and no man is able to pluck them out of my Father's hands. I and my Father are one." So you elect is being overseen and managed by this divine force, this omnipotent influence. Even to how you came into the truth, that was, according to God. you know, when you came into this truth, you know, it was part of God's, working, you know, and how you're going to continue in the truth is part of God's working, and let's touch on verse 30. St. John chapter 10, verse 30. I and my Father are one. A lot of people are confused on this scripture. In Christianity and these different religions, they think that Yahweh Shai is the Most High. That's not the case. Yahweh and Yahweh Shai are two separate entities, but they are in an agreement. They are in harmony, and ultimately Yahweh is, the most dominant, the head over Yahweh Shai. So in other words, Yahweh Shai is in agreement with the Father. More so, Yahweh being in agreement with Yahweh Shai. You just, they, Yahweh Shai is aligned with the Father, basically. And you think about, what Yahweh Shai have been doing, in the heavens from the time he went back after his, suffering and resurrection. What Yahweh Shai have been doing. He been basically doing everything, because when you think about Yahweh, he do things through the angels. So since Yahweh and Yahweh Shai are one, Yahweh Shai is basically doing things through the angels, according to Yahweh, according to Yahweh's will. So how you came into this truth, Yahweh Shai set that up. How much you learned, over the time. What measure of the things you know now. Yahweh Shai is over that. The heavens is very active. The heavens is very, mobile. Is more involved than you think. I just want to state that Yahweh Shai, he's just not up there doing nothing. I just wanted to state that Yahweh Shai is doing things according to the will of Yahweh. What you think it means? He sat down on the right hand of the Father. The scriptures tell you that he was given the throne of the Father. Yahweh set Yahweh Shai in the throne. What throne is that? The heavens. The heavens itself is under Yahweh Shai's command and will. So Yahweh Shai threw up that, that prayer. He's making sure that this prayer is being fulfilled. Basically, this prayer is performed, is done. So Yahweh Shai, just as much as Yahweh is involved, in your life, in the life of you elect, because they are one. Yahweh Shai is in alignment with Yahweh. Everything that Yahweh Shai is doing and going to do is in alignment with Yahweh. At the end of the day, above all, Yahweh, this is all Yahweh's, counsel, all Yahweh's working at the end of the day. Don't want to be overly, technical, just making a point. Yahweh Shai prayed for you elect, and that prayer is being fulfilled. You elect will be delivered from the evils. You elect will ultimately receive glory, man. And it's nothing that can bypass it, disrupt that power. There's no such thing as free will because you elect. This is greater than you. There's a purpose for you, and you have to fulfill it. Think about Jonah. He tried to flee from the will of God, from God's purpose, and the Lord brought him right back, to his purpose. So you elect is in divine hands. I wanted to go here, Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7, verse 22. It says, "For wisdom." Now, I wanted to touch. I always, gotta explain what wisdom represents here in this chapter. Wisdom ultimately represents the pure influence of God. It represents His power. His force, that divine force that floweth from the heavens. Basically. So it says, "For wisdom, which is the worker of all things, taught me, for in her is an understanding spirit, holy, one only, manifold, subtle, lively, clear, undefiled, plain, not subject to hurt." Yeah, so in other words, when it says not subject to hurt, basically you cannot disappoint, you cannot frustrate the power of God. You cannot frustrate His purposes. So the elect, there's nothing that can take them outside of that path that they're in. No matter what persecution comes, what threat of their life or of their position comes, what pain, what trial, no matter what system, what government, what kingdom, what king come against them, there's nothing that can frustrate God's purposes towards the elect. Nothing that can frustrate God's working, His activity towards the elect, His influence towards the elect. There's nothing that can disrupt that. And that's why you're going to have some of the elect in these last days be thrown in prison and beheaded. Literally dismembered for the faith. And not even that will take them outside of their purpose, their election. Not even that will hinder their faith. So it's not subject to hurt. So there's a power, a pure influence that you Edomites, you devils, any military, any system, any government can come against. It's not something that you can come against. This is the same power that parted the Red Sea, that we may walk upon dry ground. The same power that moved Noah and directed Noah upon that ark. It wasn't the ark that saved Noah and his family. It was that divine power. It was that wisdom. That pure influence of God that directed that ark. And it's very domineering. And what happens when this power, this pure influence, you know, inclines towards the good of a person, you know, well, you have the elect, you know. You know, you have Joshua, you know, calling upon God, and the sun, you know, staying past its hour. You know, you read that account in the book of Joshua. The Lord had basically the Lord stretched out time. He stretched out the day. The sun stood still longer than it should have. This is the type of power that is working towards the good of you elect. That's managing you elect for the purpose of salvation and everlasting honor, to demonstrate God's goodness, ultimately, to fulfill his purpose. It says, loving the thing that is good, quick, which cannot be letted, ready to do good. And yeah, let it means to hinder. You can't hinder this power, man. You can't hinder this pure influence. You know? You read that account in the book of Joshua, things in the book of Joshua, where, you know, the Lord performed another act, you know, where we walked past or we cut through, I think, some river, some bank of water, and the Lord basically stopped the water from coming through, and we walked right past, just like what he did with the Red Sea. He did on a smaller display. He stopped the running bank of water, and we walked right through the bank upon dry ground. You know, this is the same power that flattened the city, the walls of the city of our enemy, after we walked around it 7 times. You know, the same power that that yeah, that destroyed the firstborn of all Egypt in that time of the Egyptians, from Pharaoh to the most common, man. This is not something that you can come again. This is not something that you can hinder. You know, which Esau Edom, he's coming. He's going to come into a mind. He's coming in a spirit where, you know, he want people to be subject to this beast system. You know, digital ID. You know, you know, the MOTB system, basically on a digital leash. Basically, you know, he want to you know, prick the skin of men by, you know, putting some piece of technology in them, which is some microchip, micro chip, which is going to be used as an instrument to buy and sell. That's the MARK in the book of, mentioned in the book of Revelation. And this is the system that he's looking to bring. You know, it's going to obviously involve with AI, you know, but this is a world that he's looking to create, you know, and with much deception, you know, with much threat, you know, and oppression. He's going to try to get the people, you know, in taking it, you know, and you elect will go so far, because you're not going to take it. You know, you're going to go into prison. You're going to go to being beheaded for the faith because you're not going to take it. It's your will to not take it. It's God's purpose for you not to take it. You know, and for all we know, Esau may have a spirit where, and he may not even know that you're an Israelite. He may not, whatever soldier, whatever person in those days that may cast you into prison and be there standing in front of you while you're in prison. Take this, technology, take this, uh, so that you may live, so that you may be free. They may get up close, and personal to you. And all you gotta do is take this, take this technology, take this materials, in your body. You'll have, universal basic income, money coming to you, every appointed time. You'll be able to buy and sell. You'll be able to, you'll have access to, uh, medication that you need, whatever, you know, and but God has a purpose for you, and He's going to have you endure that. He's going to have you persevere. He's going to keep you strong through your faith, man. It's fate. It's God's purpose, man. And I do, I want to balance it out because it may be a case where, which I cannot 100% certain, but it may be a case where Esau, it may purposefully, target you believers, you Israelites, knowing that you're an Israelite, knowing that you, believe in Yahweh Ba'ashem Yahweh Shai. Maybe it's some, person of rank, of position in the military, in Esau's armed forces, three-letter agency or whatever, that may have a deep hatred towards you Israelites. And he may target you purposefully, or she, you know. And over the years, the prophets have made it known that you know, it may be on a grander scale, like as far as you Israelites being targeted. Like you Israelites may be like literally targeted on a whole nother level, and not just like on a minor scale. It may be bigger than that. Maybe putting your face on the news, you know, putting a bounty on Israelites, It may be something like that. But either way, you elect will be tempted, will be tested and tempted one way or another, you know. Well, it's going to be, um, you know, you know, whether you're going to be targeted or whatever, it don't matter. You're going to be tempted. But nevertheless, this pure divine influence, this force is going to keep you, your mind, your soul. It's going to keep you, that you may obtain victory, that you may obtain salvation. The very willpower that you're going to have in those last days to keep the way of God, to keep onto your own salvation, is of God. The fortitude, the temperance that you're going to have, that you already have, is of God. It's of that same wisdom, that same divine influence. How you think Antipas got through whatever he had to go through, which he was burnt. He was literally cooked alive. You read history accounts of Antipas. Yahweh Shai mentioned him in the book of Revelation. And Antipas, he was basically burnt. He was cooked alive in a brazen bull. A device that those Edomites use, for offenders. You know, what type of spirit, type of mind that he had to have in order to endure that, in order to keep the faith unto the end, until his last breath. You know, that was of God, man. It was the power and pure influence of God that kept his mind, man, that kept him his soul, that kept his faith, that kept him together. And I made a lesson a few days ago concerning, the different ways how God display his power. And you can read it all throughout the Bible. Fire coming down from heaven, the parting of the Red Sea, the destroying or the taking away of the firstborn children of the Egyptians, the flooding, the walking on water, the shadow of the apostles healing the sick, casting out demons, all different displays of that self same divine power of God. But you also have the display of God's power that that is more inward. That's not as loud as those different displays. You know, you know, it was God's power that put the Spirit on John the Baptist to live how he lived. To live in a life that he lived. Wearing what he wore. You could read about that, eating what he ate. He lived a very minimalist and hard lifestyle. Doing the work of God. That spirit, that mentality was a display of God's power. When Antipas he saw when he was made known, when he came to know how he was about to go out, how he was about to die, it was God's power that was working, not in a visible way, in a magnificent way, and as he did in other occasions, which at the end of the day, God's power is magnificent regardless. But it was demonstrated on a silent and inward level, on a moral level. You know, so the Lord's power, the Lord's influence it works in different ways, in many ways. You know, sometimes it's more visible, it's more striking to the sight, to the eyes. Sometimes, you know, it could just be a man who was willing to die for his faith, a soul withstanding pain. Paul, he listed all the things that he went through: being stoned, shipwrecked twice, whipped, betrayed, life sought after many times. But what kept him moving? God's power, God's influence. you know. So that same power of God can also install within a man virtue, temperance, patience, fortitude. It doesn't always have to appear, you know, like it appeared in ancient times where fire came down from heaven. So that same power, man, is going to be there for you elect. Now, we do say that there's going to be miracles, in these last days, but don't neglect those other ways on how God's power is manifested. Don't neglect it, you know. Just want to make that point. But let's continue reading. It says, "And going through all understanding, pure and most subtle spirits." Verse 24 says, "For wisdom is more moving than any motion." Yeah, you think about wind, you think about rivers. Well, the power of God is more active than that. It's more mobile. It says she passeth and goes through all things by reason of her pureness. You know, so you elect, man. You're. Hey, when a person say I have friends in high places, you truly have friends in high places, man. You know, you know, Esau like the which what makes a person powerful, by having connections, by being able to reach, uh having a large reach on the earth. That's what make a person powerful, having connections, you know. Well, you elect have friend. Hey, you elect have the heavens. Heaven itself is on the side of you elect. You know, is working for the good of you elect. Because what's an aspect of God's power? The angels. You know, the angels are there for you elect. Just like it was there for Daniel in the lion's den. Just like Yahweh Shai was there, which Yahweh Shai, he is the son, the only begotten son of God. He's the first creation of God. You could say Yahweh Shai is the first spirit, the first angel that Yahweh created. You know? Was not Yahweh Shai there for the three holy men mentioned in the book of Daniel while they was in the furnace of fire? You know? So there's not a place, there's not a time that Yahweh Bahashim Yahweh Shai, have no power in, you know? And to go deep on that, when it says she passeth and goes through all things by reason of her pureness. You think about the angels. If the Lord were to open your eyes onto the mass number of angels, you'll go mad. You'll see the great traffic of angels going to and fro. You think about what Jacob saw. When he saw the gates of heaven, the ladder, angels descending and ascending. If the Lord were to open your eyes on how many angels are moving to and fro throughout the earth, all over the earth, from heaven to heaven, you will go crazy, man. Your brain will not be able to handle it. Which I don't know what they will call it. I don't know what the Lord will call it. I'll call it a spiritual plane. That's what I'll call it. Fourth dimension. I'm not going to get into all those dimensions. Many dimensions according to man. I'll call it the spiritual plane. So in other words, Yahweh's influence is all throughout the earth. It's all throughout existence. Even reaching the mind. You know, what you think about Susanna. Those of you who read that account in the book in the Apocrypha, the history of Susanna, when she was unlawfully, unrighteously accused for committing adultery with two elder men of high position in Israel. What happened? The Lord put a Holy Spirit upon Daniel to justify and to deliver Susanna from those accusers, from unlawful and unrighteous condemnation. You know, so that shows you that the Lord is able to influence the mind. He's able to go into your mind, your heart, your brain, and control you and influence you. You know, you know, and you think about for example, you think about because some brothers, some sisters come into this truth, uh, uh um, from hearing it from another person. And sometimes those of you who came into this truth, who was revealed, uh, you know, you was revealed, or this truth was revealed to you by another person who ultimately left. Sometimes that happens to some believers, you know. Well, even that was by the permission of God, by the purpose of God, according to His will, according to His power. You know, it's the Lord's power that moved, the Lord's Spirit and power that move you elect to teach, prophesy, even someone who is not part of the elect to teach. You know, you think about the algorithm. You think about Esau's technology. You know, the algorithm, YouTube algorithm. Some believers come into this truth because they just saw a video pop up on their screen. You know, never heard about Israelites a day in their life. Sometimes a video just pop up, and even that is a working of God. Even though this is Esau's technology, the Lord is over it all at the end of the day. Because the Lord gives men wisdom and understanding to create these different things. You know? So hey, that the heavens is, in other words, is very active. It's mobile. They're very active. The kingdom of heaven, Yahweh and Yahweh Shai being the ruler of it. You know, you got the angels, you got the spirits. You know, the heavens is very active. Um, the scriptures tell you the kingdom ruleth over the kingdom of men. You know. But anyways, it says, for wisdom is more moving than any motion. She passeth and goeth through all things by reason of her pureness. For she is the breath of the power of God, and a pure influence flowing from the glory of the Almighty. Therefore can no the foul thing fall into her. And I searched up this, when those of you who are into anime, who watch, movies and stuff like that, you'll hear the word or the term plot armor. It says plot armor is a plot device wherein a fictional character is preserved from harm due to their necessity for the plot to proceed. So you elect your salvation, your victory is aligned with God's purpose, with his divine plans. And there's nothing that can come against that, basically. There's nothing that can disappoint that. There's nothing that can frustrate God's plans. So you elect another, in a way, you have plot armor. You got divine plot armor, man. This is the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 14. Is your fate. It is your fate, man. If you are part of that number, it's your fate. It says, I know that whatsoever God doeth, it shall be forever. Nothing can be put to it, nor anything taken from it. And God doeth it, that men should fear before him. Yeah, so whatever the Lord do, that's what it's going to be. And nothing can come against it. You know. Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 17. This is the mind of the wicked. It says, let us see if his words be true, and let us prove what shall happen in the end of him. For if the just man be the son of God, he will help him and deliver him from the hands of his enemies. Let us examine him with despitefulness and torture, that we may know his meekness and prove his patience. And ultimately, Esau, he's going to do this. He's coming in that mindset, where he's going to prove you elect and see whether you are patient with you, whether you truly believe. He's going to oppress. He's going to even torture. And be not afraid of this, because the Lord knoweth what you are able to handle. The scripture tell you that in the book of 1 Corinthians. You are able to endure whatever temptation that's going to come your way, ultimately. So the Lord's going to give you your fair share of suffering and pain. Some of you, he may have, some of you believers get smacked up a little. Just being realistic, man. This thing is, we have to be realist in this thing. This is the true realism. You learn realism in this thing. You learn what reality in this thing. Truth and reality are synonymous, man. So the point, no matter what Esau throw at you, your elect will endure ultimately. Now I wanted to touch on this, Proverbs chapter 16, verse 33. The lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. Now, in the ancient times, people would cast lots. Now, it's speculated to be stones, certain rocks called lots, or used for throwing lots. They will throw something. There's a lot of information surrounding it. I'm not going to go into detail what exactly how they did it, but basically it was a form of decision making, a system or a device used to decide upon something. Basically a modern form of it would be flipping a coin or rolling the dice, to help a person choose or decide upon something. If there's the last pizza in a pizza box, two friends will flip a coin, to decide upon who gets to have that pizza. That would be a modern form of casting lots. So let's continue reading, to make my point. It says, the lot is cast into the lap, but the whole disposing thereof is of the Lord. Now, when you go into that word disposing, it goes into decision. So basically, the Lord decide everything. Everything the Lord's decide is the Lord's decision, basically. So in ancient times, it would be casting lots, maybe throwing stones. However they did it, I can't really remember how exactly they did it. And in a modern time, it would be flipping a coin or rolling a dice. But nevertheless, it's all the Lord's decision. And so what this scripture should show you, that something as small as flipping a coin and how the coin lands, what side the coin go upon, how the dices fall and where do they fall. Even something as small as that is of the Lord's decision. So this should show you that there's no such thing as free will. Now, I do say this to balance it out, to not be overly wise. Human beings have capacity. They have power, intellectual, physical. We have our God-given capacity, just like with ants. They have their God-given capacity. They're able to lift things, bigger than they. Just like with chameleons, they have their abilities. They have their power. So every creature, living organism has their measure of capacity. Whether it be intellectual or whatever, physical, whatever, bodily, whatever. So us men, we have power. Yes, we have power. We have ability. We have capacity. Whatever you want to say, it's limited. We have to acknowledge that it's limited. Even though it's limited, we should still act upon that power. We should still fulfill that or exercise our ability. There's some abilities, there's some powers that we are born with. There's some powers that we learn. And the Lord is not against us acting with our power. But that doesn't mean, right, we are strong enough to control our destiny. To balance it out. I just want, I wanted to say that, because I don't want you to think that, for example, say, you want something. Say you want a car or something. You want a new car or whatever. Seek God. That's the right choice. Ask God. That's humility. Everything is according to His will. At the end of the day. But that doesn't mean that you should hold yourself back from acting and seeking to get a car. Yes, the Lord's in control of everything, but He has given you power to do certain things. But it's right to know that we're limited, no matter what type of power or capacity we have as human beings, living organisms, as males. Females have their own type of power as females. We just, but we're limited and we're subject to Yahweh Bashim Yahushua. See, men become proud to thinking that they're able to do things beyond, their God-given right. And that's why you have men who will kill millions and get away with it, aka Esau Edom. Have a godlike mentality. You know, men think they are able to rule forever, aka Esau Edom. You know, men think that their throne, kings think their throne will continue forever. That's forms of pride. That's examples of pride. So yes, we have power as human beings, as living organisms. Yes, we have power. We have capacity, we have ability, and we are able to act upon these things, or act with these things, or through these things, shall I say. Yes, a man have the power to profit himself. We got 2 legs, 2 arms, man. We have eyes and a mouth to speak. We have a mind, and yes, we are able to do these. We are able to do certain things with these things, but we are still limited, and we're still under God. And Lord will I made it make, I'm not a good speaker, but Lord will I made that, I made it make sense. I want to give all praises and honor and glory to Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh Shai Shalom.